Hey everyone, happy holidays and welcome to the final edition of 2020 of SportsBeak, episode 40 of our show. I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
This is a jam-packed show. There's a lot going on. The NBA season just got started. We had our preview last week. Tim, I'm sorry you missed it. It was pretty fun, and Fisher was going back and forth on a lot of his picks, but it was good, and the NBA season has been really exciting to start. We'll get to that, along with the San Diego Padres, who had maybe their best day in terms of free agency and everything, and maybe franchise history. Two big trades in the same day for big pitchers, Blake Snell and Yu Darvish. We'll get to that. Plus previewing the college football playoff and an action-packed Week 17 in the NFL. Before I get to that, though, this might not matter too much to the other viewers of the show, but I'm pretty pumped. I beat you in fantasy in the playoffs, and I'm 7-7 and going to the championship. And last night was crazy. I just want to say, because I have Josh Allen in our league, and you had Cole Beasley. And then me and my dad, we have a team. We were going for a third straight championship. We had Beasley, and we're going up against Josh Allen. There was only about a 4-point window between Allen and Beasley of a happy medium where both the teams could win, and we got that. So I'm pretty pumped right now.
Well, let's not forget the other thing that you had against me. You had Stephon Diggs, which was the bigger crusher. Going into Monday, I had a 42-point lead. I was feeling as confident as ever. Cole Beasley was looking for his first career 1,000-yard season. Unfortunately, that's going to have to wait another week. And unfortunately, the worst week for me to blow a fantasy lead was potentially the semifinal game of the playoffs, might I add. And for you to make the playoffs on a tiebreaker, you beat the defending champion of Ian last week to turn around and now beat me, who was the 1 seed. You get to face the other Eddie of Eddie McCarthy for the Bruce Beck Sports Broadcasting Fantasy Football Championship next week. I'll tell you what, that is a hard team to beat as well. Very high scoring, but as we can see from that Buffalo offense, I wouldn't be surprised if anything. But I do want to say one more thing regarding how fantasy is going this year, because my biggest struggle this week, if it wasn't watching the Giants lose, it was definitely having to bench Russell Wilson, have Keenan Allen be hurt, and have to play Cole Beasley over him, and then also having a Ronald Jones injury with having no eligible running backs to sign. I get to play Wayne Gallman. So you want to talk about an awkward week? This is how the end of the NFL season is looking. And not only does it stink for fantasy owners who have had very good years such as I, but at the end of the day, this is what makes the NFL exciting in terms of what we're going to see. I mean, we already are starting to see Week 17 mayhem. And to be honest, at least especially on the AFC side, and even on the NFC side, this is the most exciting playoff picture we've had really in a while. I mean, when's the last time we had 4 or 5 teams that have a chance of making the playoffs and there's not a single wild card clinch going to Week 17?
It's insane. And really, the only team that is locked in their position is that the Chiefs are going to be the 1 seed in the AFC. That's it. There's so much movement that can happen. And like you said, with these injuries, with COVID thrown into it, I mean, we're going to have a Cardinals-Rams game where there's a good chance it's going to be John Wolford and Chris Streveler as the 2 starting quarterbacks in a game with major playoff implications. It's a wild year, but we'll get to the NFL in a bit. We haven't done this in a while. Let's do our SCC recap of the last week. I'm going to start with my surprise, and we're going to talk a little baseball here. The San Diego Padres, I knew they were going to be aggressive in the offseason. We've seen A.J. Preller do it before and be unsuccessful, but bringing in Yu Darvish and Blake Snell on the same day, might I add, to complement an already very stacked rotation that already has Chris Paddock, among others. They've got a lot of young pitching prospects. And by the way, other than Paulino, they didn't really have to give up any of those other ones. So they still have a really strong farm system that they can use for the future, or use in any other bigger deals to try to, make that offense stronger. So big moves by the Padres. Kind of surprised that both of those came to fruition. And they also signed one of the Korean League guys, a shortstop as well. So that's 3 big moves on one day in a winter meetings that is so unconventional. And we haven't really seen much happen other than that other Josh Bell trade to Washington. So kudos to the Padres. on getting all that accomplished in just a single day. My expectation, the Lakers losing on opening night to the Clippers. The Clippers, just the situation when you have to watch a ring ceremony for another team in your own arena, and then have to play against them. I'm not surprised that the Clippers won that game. And I'm also not surprised that then they lose by 51 to Dallas, because that's just the Clippers that we've become accustomed to. They're able to beat the Lakers when it doesn't really matter. They can't beat them when it does matter. And when it seems like things are going well, suddenly they fall apart. And that performance against Dallas, I know Kawhi was out, but still, does Kawhi Leonard make that much of a difference where you go from one of the best teams in the West to losing by 50 to Dallas? But honestly, not too surprised about either of those results. And I think the Clippers are just going to follow the same path as last year. And finally, in conclusion, it's basically what you just said, and you might say the same thing. This NFL weekend on Sunday, it's going to be wild. Just so much on the line. There might not be that typical NFC East game where the winner, takes the division, because Sunday Night Football, it's Washington can just win it regardless of what happens in the Cowboy-Giant game. But it's still going to be a fun week because there's just so much on the line. And the fact that you could have, and it's very possible, it's not like this is an extreme circumstance, you could have a 6-win team win a division and get a home playoff game in the NFC, and an 8-win team get in as a wild card in the Cardinals or the Bears. Very likely that could happen. Cardinals are playing the Rams. Bears are playing the Packers. A loss for both of those teams would not be that surprising. And then on the AFC side, have a situation where a team with at least 10 wins, possibly 11 wins, does not make the playoffs. An expanded postseason is really unprecedented, but that's the glory of the NFL.
Yeah, that's what makes it interesting. But yet again, it's the split between both conferences. And, what can you do when you have division rules and not everything based upon full record? This is the result you get, which is essentially full mayhem. But you know what? As fans, you kind of dig it, because let's be honest, as a Giants fan perspective, do I want them to win the NFC East? Absolutely. But on this opposite end as well, whoever wins the NFC East, you kind of want to root for as the underdog. Just like how, for example, when Cam Newton went below 500 with the Panthers and they went around and won their first playoff game before, of course, losing in the divisional round. I think the same standard's held here, where you kind of want to see these teams do well, in regards to how it goes. And the other reason why I want to say you want to see these teams do well is, let's not forget the biggest blow these teams are going to face. Sure, you get a home playoff game, but let's not forget the fact that at most you win 6 games in the season, and what was supposed to be a top 10 pick, now you pick as early as pick 19. You lose 9 very huge spots in draft minimum. So I think that's the bigger blow that these teams take. But again, it's what the NFL draws up in terms of schedules. And on the AFC side, sure, you win 10, 11 ball games, you may miss. But again, that's just how it is. And it shows how good the league is on the AFC side this year in particular. And why, again, you have to compete with the Chiefs. Every team to an extent is finding a way to do that. And it shows that this is going to be a good playoff, because let's be honest, just like how the Raiders knocked off the Chiefs earlier this year, doesn't mean the Chiefs have, a good little walk to the Super Bowl yet again. Anyone can win. But now I do want to go with my SEC, and I'm going to start with my S. And you briefly mentioned the Clippers and the Lakers. I'm going to go with the entirety of the NBA, however, throughout these first 3 games. If you told me through these first 3 games, the Orlando Magic and the Cleveland Cavaliers would be tied for the 1 seed in the Eastern Conference, I would call you nuts. And to add on as well, the Hawks and the Pacers, who have started off 3-0, I simply wouldn't believe you. And then on the Western Conference side, somehow, some way, every team has lost a basketball game at least once. And the Pelicans, the Minnesota Timberwolves, the Phoenix Suns, and somehow the Kings are inside the top 8. And again, I know it's 3 games, But, folks, these are teams that were supposed to lose basketball games on a regular basis. And they're above 500 to open up the first week of NBA action. And might I add, for example, the Timberwolves beating a good Utah Jazz team, as well as you mentioned, for example, the Mavericks, all on top of the Clippers. It makes no sense at all. But again, it's a long season. There are some expectations that still lasted. For example, the Golden State Warriors. And needless to say, yeah, it's been surprising. It'll continue to be surprising simply because of the fact that it is 2020. But now we move to my expectation, and you kind of mentioned a little bit as you're surprised at the San Diego Padres. I will admit I'm surprised at who they got, but I expected them to sign pitching this offseason. That was their big fault last year. They had the offense. They had the capabilities to put 7-8 runs up a ball game, but they didn't have the pitching to back it up. Yes, they had the youth, but they just didn't have the names. To get Blake Snell, that was huge. Yu Darvish has underperformed a little bit as of late in terms of how it's gone since he's left Texas. However, he's still very much a star pitcher and a very key piece. Can he go back to his pre-existing form? I would hope so. But let's not forget that Darvish essentially is almost out the door in regards to his age. I mean, Darvish is closing in what? Towards mid-30s now, if I'm not mistaken, because he joined the league late. Yeah, so 34. So it's not like Darvish has that much huge value in the big picture. But for winning a World Series and trying to compete with the Los Angeles Dodgers, these moves were a must. And to be honest, in the big picture, Eddie, I think this really sets the Padres, if they don't win the NL West, this sets them up to be a huge wild card team and a huge push or a huge driving force in the postseason in particular. And we're going to be looking for this battle all season long between both divisions. And I am going to say this too, with all the money they've saved up through the years, and I was talking about this yesterday, to think that in their system prior to that new era with Fernando Tatis and Manny Machado, that the best player that's walked through their system, essentially, and it wasn't even from their system of late, was Matt Kemp. Makes you really think of how hard they've been taking. They were the Marlins before the Marlins of what we knew today. So the fact that they have a lot of money to go out and make moves doesn't surprise me in the market they're in. And I think there's only going to be more moves to come for this team to try to get even better for the 2021 season. And in conclusion, I will say this. I already mentioned how 2020 is only going to get crazier. I can't imagine or even fathom to think what 2021 is going to be. If it is any crazier than what we've seen this entirety of 2020, sports fans, start getting on your seats, because I know most of you still can't be in your favorite team stadiums or physically there watching games, depending on where you live. But when you're at home, I've had the time of my life watching every single sport on television, because you don't know what to expect on a day in and day out basis. And if 2021 stays that same exact way, it's only going to get better and better until, of course, coronavirus is gone. But it's been one heck of a ride, and it's brought a lot of new fans in every other kind of sport, seems like, as of late.
Well, absolutely. And at the end of the show, we'll recap some of our best sports moments from 2020. But, fingers crossed, the vaccine's starting to make its way out. Hopefully, sometime in 2021, we can get some fans back in more stadiums. But regardless, like you said, people at home have been able to enjoy watching sports. And I think it's been a real coping mechanism with everything going on in our country and our world. And, it's been a great year. And, hockey's on its way back very soon. The NBA is back in full swing. And I kind of want to start it there with basketball, because my first thing, in some places it seems a little weird, like Madison Square Garden, seeing like the big Knicks boards around instead of Celebrity Row. It feels like they're playing in a practice facility. But in other places, it really doesn't feel that different from a regular game. And the NBA players, I mean, first of all, kudos to the league so far. I mean, counting preseason and training camp, it's been almost a month that the players have been together. And other than James Harden, there's been no issues so far. And Adam Silver, we know how well he did with the bubble. And we talked about this a few shows ago. This is a totally different animal. Releasing the players, so to say, out into the wild, out into the world, instead of being secluded in one area where things are going to be safe when you can control them. And we've seen the issues that both baseball and football faced, especially early on. And at this point, a week in, there have been no issues except for the James Harden thing. And that was taken care of pretty quickly. They just quarantined the players that had been in close contacts of Harden. Harden was cleared, never tested positive, and the Rockets are going to be back at full strength probably for Wednesday's game. So really good job so far. But a couple teams I want to highlight. You talked about some of the surprises. I want to talk about the Nets to start with because they blew out the Warriors in the season opener. I don't think there was much of a surprise there. Irving and Durant's debut together. Boston, I was a little surprised by the extent of how much they beat them by. I thought the Celtics were going to put up a better fight in that second half. But these last two games, I've watched the ending of both, and it hasn't been particularly pretty. They're now 2-2. Game against Charlotte, Irving and Durant were out there. They lost Dinwiddie to injury early in the game, but Kevin Durant misses a jumper that he always makes, literally 10 feet from the basket, that would have tied the game, and Charlotte ends up winning. And then last night, they give Kyrie and Durant their load management. Karis LeVert leads them back, but a really bad decision by Steve Nash in the end of the fourth quarter, which is the one reason why I have my concerns about the Nets and why I did not, on the season preview, I said the Bucks were going to win the East. I thought the Nets were going to get to the Eastern Conference Finals. I did not have them making the championship game, the finals this year, because I don't know what Steve Nash brings to the table. And I know Mike D'Antoni's there as a veteran coach, but Mike D'Antoni's had his own questionable decisions in the past, especially with the Rockets in the last couple of years. You have players other than Karis LeVert on the court who are capable of making shots. The fact that with 10 seconds left in a tie game, you have LeVert try a deep three-pointer, and it was clear that was the only option on the play. They just did a complete ISO. Everybody just stood there, and then it was LeVert against Kyle Anderson, and LeVert misses the three. And then another bad decision. Joe Harris takes a bad three-pointer in overtime. Memphis wins the game by 5. That's what kind of concerns me about the Nets. And losing Dinwiddie is huge for this team. Now he's out the rest of the season. And the depth that the Nets had, been so proud about, and that was the reason why they were hesitant to trade for James Harden, because they would lose that. Now the main piece of that depth, Spencer Dinwiddie, will not be there the rest of the season. So where do you I know it's early. I know it's only 4 games in, but obviously there are some concerns with this team. Where do you see them going from here? And do you think any sort of trade with James Harden could be imminent sometime down the line this season?
Well, I don't know in regards to the James Harden trade, if you ever even see a trade happen, if I'm being honest, based upon what I've seen the past few weeks in particular, James Harden is always going to be a storyline, let's be honest. And to me, it's a storyline that's going nowhere. He's going to stay in Houston. And if he does get traded, then so be it. But I really think he's still the centerpiece there. And I just don't see him really being a good teammate, if I'm being honest, on any other team. Sure, he can go to Brooklyn and win, but I don't see that happening. But now on the Nets side, I made a prediction, obviously, before the season. I know I wasn't here on the last show, but I said that the Nets are going to go all the way in the East. I didn't have them winning. I had the Lakers winning back-to-back titles. But at the same time, I'm not going to, say, sure, you lose Dinwiddie, you lose depth, you're not going to be successful. Let's not forget the fact that this team has Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving still. Yes, they were on load management, but let's not forget why they're on load management. That's because of the fact that they have an injury history, and especially for Kevin Durant, who has to relearn how to get physical on the basketball floor, I think is something that's relatively huge, and I got to give Steve Nash credit for. Now, is he going to make mistakes? Absolutely. He's a rookie coach. His play calling isn't necessarily going to be 100%, but that's the point of winning and losing. And I think that what you have to remember is that, yes, we don't know what to expect, but it's early on in the season. If we see improvements as the year goes on in what decisions he makes, that's the difference from a team that's going to be successful come the postseason and not. Yes, obviously the players on the floor dictate that, but the players also have to have some trust and faith in Steve Nash if they're going to want to be successful. And I think that the Nets still have that capability. This team has a lot still to develop with. They're going to want to win a lot of basketball games. I think that you're going to see Kevin Durant get better and better as the season goes on. And one thing in particular that I say you're going to see Kevin Durant get better in is not on the offensive end. He's actually been excellent on the offensive end throughout these first 3 games. His numbers are still right on stat to where he was in Golden State with Steph Curry. However, it's been the defensive end, the rebounds, the being up there. He's an all-time high in terms of his career through these 3 games in terms of personal fouls. So to me, he's got to get back to being that defender that we know him to be and getting more physical while protecting himself. But that's going to take some time coming back from an injury like this. So I think in that factor, Durant is still developing again back into where he was, but at the same time, he hasn't missed a beat on the floor, and he'll very soon become that two-way player. And for Kyrie Irving, again, it's staying healthy. As long as he can stay healthy on the floor, this team will continue to win basketball games. So, again, in conclusion, Eddie, I'm not too worried. I think they do make a trade eventually for depth. I just don't think it's going to be James Harden. To me, it's just not realistic.
I don't think James Harden would fit with this team at all because it's difficult enough between Irving and Durant, who gets the key shot. And I feel like that's been the problem. I know there's been big threes and dynamic duos that have found their success in the NBA, but one issue that those teams continue to run into is in a late game moment, who gets that last shot? Think about the Raptors 2 years ago, because they're the opposite of this. It was obvious Kawhi Leonard was going to be the one taking the shots, and they ended up winning the championship. If you think about the Heat from years ago, Golden State a similar way. They lost some games because there was indecisiveness about who should shoot that final shot, and that's exactly what happened in the Nets game on Sunday night against Charlotte. Durant took that shot. Kyrie was open, but it's tough to decide. And the concern I have with the Nets, now that Dinwiddie's hurt, because that's huge for this team. I know he was starting at shooting guard, but he's your other point guard. They had to play Chris Chiozza at point guard last night, who was 5'10" and gets pushed around by basically everybody and constantly turns over the ball. He was good in the bubble last year. He's not going to be good throughout the season as an NBA player. They need to find another point guard. James Harden's not the answer. You could find someone who is a lot less costly that can play the position well. Maybe there's someone even in free agency that would be an upgrade from Chiozza, who, by the way, they put on waivers, but nobody claimed him, so he ended up coming back. They need to find another point guard because they cannot just rely on him when Kyrie Irving is out, because this is not the first and only time they're going to do load management this year. I know the NBA kind of blocked. I think there's a rule you can't do it on nationally televised games now, but that means a lot of the times when they're not on national television, Kyrie and Durant are going to get limited minutes, especially Durant, but Irving too, because people always forget Irving's coming off of some pretty bad injuries with his shoulder and with his ankle last year. Irving got really banged up last season multiple times, so it's going to be tough. But I want to shift gears to baseball. We talked about the Padres enough, but there was another trade that I think is kind of interesting. Josh Bell got traded to Washington for a couple B-level prospects. Bell did not have a good 2020. But he has been a very good player in the past. And the Nationals are a team that have taken a major step back since their World Series title. I mean, that's not really a surprise. We see that every year. That's why I know it's a long time down the road. That's why I think the Padres are in a perfect position, because I think the Dodgers could kind of let up a little bit after finally getting that World Series title. But Washington, I mean, they were really non-competitive last year. And I know some people are saying, well, that's how they were the World Series season in their first 60 games. They started 21-39 and they ended up winning the World Series. But there are issues with that team, and they fit that same mold, I feel like, that you've talked about with the Ravens and the 49ers in the NFL, that they don't make a lot of changes. They stick with the same core of guys that are getting older. Trey Turner is the only real bit of youth, him and Soto. And then, I mean, Zimmerman, let's see what the situation is. If he decides to come back for another season, you've gotten rid of Rendon, no more Murphy, no more Harper. There's a lot of openings on that team. And that pitching staff, Scherzer had his worst year in a while in 2020, and Steven Strasburg, always the injury history. And with how the NL East is shaping up, the Mets now having money to spend, the Braves, maybe the favorites in the National League this year, the Phillies are getting progressively better, and even the Marlins are starting to look more respectable. How much does this Josh Bell move really benefit Washington? I don't see this being the end-all, be-all that makes them a competitor once again.
I think this move, if I'm being honest, was made as a result of Howie Kendrick retiring. When it's all said and done, I don't really see much benefit in this. I think Washington is going to continue to be Washington. I mean, Josh Bell is a phenomenal player. Do not get me wrong by any means. But when it's all said and done, there has to be a process to make success happen. There has to be a process of a continuing path of improvement. We knew this team was going to be bad last year in the short season. We didn't know they were going to be that bad. I think that this year, they're going to be a bad team again. But it's how bad are they going to be? Because I don't think they're going to be Houston Astro bad from those terrible, terrible years ranging from 2013 to 2015. But this is a team that really doesn't have a purpose to win. The trade makes no sense. But if it's a process of direction, then I guess I could say I'm okay with it. But if it's just simply a response to the fact that they may not re-sign Ryan Zimmerman or the fact that Howie Kendrick retired, then it makes no sense. There's no development to it. So if Washington doesn't make moves throughout the rest of this offseason, that picture is going to be painted very clear on what their thoughts of this all was. And it's going to prove that it's going to be going nowhere anytime soon. And that team will continue to be carried by Strasburg as well as Scherzer. But that's really about it, because I don't see anything positive going forward. And it, to be honest, if it continues like this, Eddie, could spiral into a Miami Marlins situation. If you remember from a few years back, having to trade Yelich, Ozuna, and Stanton away to essentially, I don't want to say tank, because your intent's never to tank, but they're getting everyone away. And I wouldn't be surprised if you see a young Soto gone, Trey Turner gone, and everyone else completely stripped out of that system within the next 3 seasons if this is how it's going to be.
And if you're just relying on your pitching in Strasburg and Scherzer to carry your team, I mean, shouldn't the Nationals know from past experience in that division? Think about the Mets 5 years ago. Think about the Braves for almost 15 years. If you're relying on your pitching, that's not going to get you championships. That's not going to get you very far in the playoffs because, the surprising unsung hero, the Mike Brasso, the Travis Ishikawa, those are the offensive players that show out in the playoffs. You don't see that with pitchers. You see it with offensive guys that have surprisingly good performances in the postseason. And you see even the best pitchers, like a Scherzer, like a Clayton Kershaw, have trouble in the postseason in the big spotlight. So I don't know what Washington's direction is, but still a lot of time here. We knew winter meetings was going to be slow getting out of the get-go this year with COVID, with everything being done virtually, with teams not having the same finances for the most part as they would in a typical year because they did not get, a lot of money from attendance and such. So a lot to think about, and a lot will happen in January and February. Before we get to the NFL, college football playoff is again this weekend. Of course, there was a lot of controversy with Notre Dame getting in, and Notre Dame gets blown out every single time they're in a big bowl. And they'll have to face Alabama and Devontae Smith and Mac Jones again in the Rose Bowl in Texas. So that's already weird enough. And then the other game is a rematch between Clemson and Ohio State. Second straight year, Trevor Lawrence and Justin Fields will face off in the matinee game of the college football playoff semifinals. I'm really intrigued to watch that one. I think Alabama Notre Dame is going to be a blowout of disastrous proportions. I mean, what do you see, and do you think the committee got this right this year?
To be honest, I think they got it right in terms of the 4 teams, but I don't think they got it right in terms of seeding. Ohio State, and I'm an Ohio State Buckeyes fan for the record, does not deserve to be the 3 seed. They deserve to be the 4 seed, especially after that game in the SEC championship, or excuse me, not SEC championship, rather Big Ten championship. It's a little bit concerning. And, you know, when you turn around and you barely score points, I mean, barely score points against a team that, yes, don't get me wrong, is inside the top 25, but is somewhat mediocre in terms of their offense and defense, it really does bother me. I don't think they're going to compete with Clemson. I really don't. This is actually, in my opinion, the weakest Ohio State team we've seen in a while. And I mean that seriously. I don't think they have anything for Clemson. I think Notre Dame has a better chance at beating a Clemson team. But unfortunately, Notre Dame, as you know, you expect it to be a one-sided affair in benefit of Alabama. Well, the realistic aspect is that this college football playoff system should have had 8 teams in a year like this, but it didn't. And we've already proven that this system is flawed because teams, for example, like a Tennessee that's, you know, played well, unfortunately suffer because of the fact that they don't get their proven opportunities and get to settle with bowl games. Congratulations. You were great this year, but you get to play a meaningless another football game, which is why so many players sit out to pursue NFL careers because it's not worth the risk of them hurting themselves. But here in the college playoffs, every game means something. And the fact of the matter is, it almost feels like, if I'm being honest, it's 2 meaningless football games. Yes, you can't predict what happens, but come on, you and I both can predict what's going to happen between Alabama and Notre Dame. And I'm saying it from my perspective, I can already see Clemson continuing to own Ohio State. It's not the fact that there's 2 over-dominant football teams, but it's more the fact that the matchups that should have been didn't align the proper way, in my opinion. And at the end of the day, it's going to prove to be, yet again, another Alabama-Clemson national title game.
Well, yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you on that. I think Alabama and Clemson are overwhelmingly the 2 best teams. Honestly, this year might have actually worked in the BCS system if you just put Alabama against Clemson in a title game. I still think Clemson's going to win, but I think that game's going to be slightly more competitive because here's my concerns with Notre Dame. I know they beat Clemson this year, but that was also when Clemson was in a frenzy without Trevor Lawrence, and that was also a home game. When it was a neutral site, so a similar situation to a college football playoff game where they're playing against a team at full strength, they got blown out, and that game was really not competitive. Notre Dame got off to a really good start this year, but their last couple games have not been great. A couple weeks ago, Syracuse, who, I mean, they have a brutal football team right now. I mean, they played Notre Dame tough into the third quarter, and that's my concern with them. Ohio State, I agree. First of all, I don't agree with the Big Ten changing the rule just to get Ohio State into the Big Ten championship game to start with, but that's a discussion for another time. But, you know, Northwestern is a good team, but Northwestern also lost to Michigan State, who got beaten by Rutgers this year. So the fact that Ohio State could not get away from them, that's a little concerning. And Ohio State just, I feel like historically, and I'd go for basically Big Ten football over the last 10 years, aside from the 1 year with Ezekiel Elliott and Cardale Jones, has been overrated. That's just what it is. the Big Ten teams cannot compete against the SEC and the ACC teams when it comes down to the big stage. People say that's the case with the Big 12, with Oklahoma. Well, guess what? It's the same case with the Big Ten. You can throw them in. Michigan has underperformed every year that Jim Harbaugh has been the coach. The 2 years Michigan State made the college football playoff, they got destroyed by Alabama. And Ohio State, other than that 1 year, things have not gone well for them in the playoff. And the real telltale sign is this. When you think about Ohio State, just in the last 10 years, when you think about the quarterbacks that they have had.
You read my eyes because I was going to mention it. I was going to mention it. We had a big conversation about it yesterday.
Yes.
Every quarterback that's gone to the NFL has had this hype, and you can go through every single one of them, and yet none of them have lived up to a professional level. And not even that, they haven't been well in the NFL, but it goes back to how it's looked in college football, and it really does tell the same exact story, Eddie.
Mm-hmm. And think about the teams that those guys have played against and the quarterbacks. They faced a Deshaun Watson in the college football playoffs and gotten destroyed. Deshaun Watson is one of the premier quarterbacks in the NFL now. JT Barrett was playing in the AAF and then some weird league in the Alamo Dome that I saw on CBS Sports Network last year. Terrell Pryor and Braxton Miller became wide receivers in the NFL. And I'm sorry to say, I know everybody's hyping up Justin Fields, but I was watching that game against Northwestern. He is very small. He is not as mobile as people say he is. I kind of have concerns about him going to the NFL. I know Baker Mayfield and Kyler Murray have both found success as smaller quarterbacks, but I think that both of them played in better systems to get them ready for the NFL, playing a lot more pistol and shotgun with Oklahoma than Ohio State has with Justin Fields. And I don't know how he's going to stand, but that we can save that for another time. What I just want to say is this. I think Ohio State's going to put up a better fight than Notre Dame, but I think it's easily Alabama, Clemson. I might think that this year maybe BCS would have actually worked with the two of those teams, but in the long run, I don't see why you can't do an 8-team playoff. And I'm telling you, if Cincinnati crushes Georgia in the Peach Bowl, if twice in a row an undefeated American athletic team crushes an SEC team in the bowl game, there is no reason why those teams should not be given a fair shot in the playoff to see how they could do. Because frankly, if Cincinnati beats Georgia really badly, or even beats them in general, I don't see what makes them that much worse of a team than Ohio State or Notre Dame.
Yeah, I'm going to have to agree with that. I apologize earlier. I said Tennessee rather meaning Cincinnati. And that really is true. I think Cincinnati has what it takes to be a college football playoff team. But again, it goes back to this system and what they need to improve. But, and if I'm being honest, for the NCAA, it would make more money having an 8 playoff team. Even if you had a 32 team system, it would make them a whole lot of money. But the fact is that they're stuck in their own ways and things aren't going to change anytime soon. And we can only ask and hope, just like, for example, the money situation for players in college sports. We hope that they can only listen and try to work, and maybe there will be change down the road. But at least throughout the next 2 years, Eddie, I really don't see much happening, and it's going to continue to be upset after upset in terms of good football teams that don't get their right due because of the fact that they don't play in a big conference as what they rightfully should.
So let's move to our last topic, the NFL. And speaking of Ohio State quarterbacks who have failed in the NFL, Dwayne Haskins released by Washington after partying maskless after getting beaten by the Seahawks. And now Washington is going to be going with an unhealthy Alex Smith or Taylor Heineke to try to win a division against Philadelphia on Sunday Night Football. It's a weird year in the NFC East, and you knew something crazy. And, I mean, the fact that it could come down to an injured Alex Smith, Andy Dalton, or Daniel Jones leading their team to the postseason to get a home playoff game, I mean, it's kind of crazy. Let's just start with this. I know we're doing our pick-em later, and I believe you picked both of the NFC East games, but how do you see this shaking up in the NFC East?
Honestly, I have no idea. I mean, you can play both scenarios to a T, and things can work out for the Giants, things can work out for the Cowboys, or of course, things can just simply work out for Washington. But the main question is Alex Smith going to continue to be Alex Smith come this week for Washington? Is Daniel Jones actually going to be a relevant quarterback on week 17 against a terrible Dallas Cowboys defense? And is Andy Dalton going to do Andy Dalton-like things, carrying another team to the playoffs just to yet again choke again come the wild card round? I honestly don't know what to expect. Honestly, I think the team that does have the upper edge, of course, is Washington, as all they need to do is simply win to make it in. But at the same time, yes, I know the Eagles lost last week to Dallas. I am a little bit invested into that team in regards to the fact that there has been surprisingly some progress made over the last 3 weeks, including a big win over the Saints, might I add. So I think that that's going to be an interesting game to watch. And I'm really digging that game as well, being a Sunday night football game. Of course, having the stipulation, knowing that at 1 p.m., whoever wins the Giants-Cowboys game ultimately will be the one waiting to see if they will be NFC East champions come Sunday night.
Yeah, I know a lot of people are angry that the Eagles, who are not even in the playoff picture whatsoever, are part of that Sunday night game, but it makes logical sense that the Giants and Cowboys game comes first, and then they get to see afterwards, will they end up getting in? Because if it was the other way around, if Washington won a 1 o'clock game, the Giants-Cowboys game would be meaningless. So I think it makes sense the way they put it together. One other thing I want to talk about before our pick'em are the Cleveland Browns. And I've got kind of maybe a weird opinion on this, but I think they actually have to be thankful that the Steelers won the AFC North last week, that they beat the Colts. Here's why. First of all, that was an embarrassing performance by Baker Mayfield against the Jets. I know the Jets have been playing a slightly better football, but 3 fumbles against the Jets defense in pretty decent weather at MetLife Stadium, you cannot do that. And I know he had no receivers, but that doesn't explain his ball control issues. That also doesn't explain the defense having trouble shutting down Sam Darnold, or the run game, Nick Chubb not being able to get past the line of scrimmage. I mean, that game was disastrous for Cleveland. And, this postseason is shaping up perfectly for a situation, in typical Browns fashion, for them to win 10 games and not make the playoffs. But they have to be, maybe it's too bad to some people. They're not going to have a chance to win the division. Because if the Steelers lost, then that Steelers-Browns game set up a potential where Cleveland could try to win the AFC North. But I think it's better the other way around, because Mike Tomlin announced Ben Roethlisberger is sitting week 17. Mason Rudolph is starting. We know the history there, and we know how charged up the Browns defense will be to try to crush Mason Rudolph and beat the Steelers. And now we know the Steelers aren't going to be playing as tough. So the fact that Pittsburgh already clinched the division and won't be playing as hard gives Cleveland a good chance to win the game, and Mason Rudolph being the starter gives them a whole lot more incentive. I think that's the gift Cleveland needs, to not have a heartbreaking winter where they end up at 10-6 and miss the playoffs. But I think Cleveland is very lucky, because this is not a good situation for them right now. Not only do you have receivers with COVID, you've got Baker coming off a loss to the Jets, a poor defensive performance, and now you got to face off with Pittsburgh, who finally got some of their mojo back after that 3-game losing streak. But they're very fortunate that Mason Rudolph is starting that game on Sunday.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, first off, I can't even begin to tell you how angry I am at Baker Mayfield after that Sunday performance against the Jets. Ruining my fantasy playoffs doesn't make me too happy. Of course, I already have my thoughts about him being an NFL quarterback and how he's overrated, but that's another discussion for another time. I think, though, that when you look at this game, I mean, it's being handed to them, but it's very strategic by Pittsburgh, might I add. Because if you do all the math and you add up, let's realize this one thing. If the Steelers lose on Sunday, guess who they're very likely going to be playing in the first round of the playoffs? The Cleveland Browns, yet again. So why not bench Ben Roethlisberger? And I know their intent's not to lose, but why not benefit having more studied film on a team twice in a given season to then turn around and try to find success for them the third time? Don't get me wrong, the Steelers have been struggling. They've lacked to be one-dimensional. But let's not forget the fact that, yes, they've struggled against other football teams, but they have not struggled against the Cleveland Browns in any shape or form. So I think that Mike Tomlin, again, he's a very strategical coach. This is the card he's going to play. The Browns, you've been handed everything now. You've been handed your ticket to the postseason. You've got to make it matter, and you have to make Pittsburgh pay for letting you essentially get your ticket punched in because they feel you're a weaker opponent than, for example, the Indianapolis Colts, the Miami Dolphins, or potentially any other team that had the chance of making the playoffs. So I think the fact of the matter is it's a big play by Pittsburgh. I'm also excited to see how Myles Garrett handles, the whole situation, with Mason Rudolph, the first time them being on the field together since the helmet incident. And I think it's going to be, again, an interesting game from start to finish. But if Cleveland doesn't win, I'm sorry, Browns fans, it goes right back to you in regards to the fact that it is a factory of sadness continuously.
Yeah, so let's move on to our weekly pick'em. By the way, we're going to be continuing this for every game in the postseason. My current record is 40-8. Tim is 3 games back at 37-11. Let me share mine first. I do think the Browns are going to get that win over Mason Rudolph and the Steelers. Myles Garrett and that defense is going to be very motivated to get that victory. Ravens have been playing great football, their best all year these last couple of weeks. I know the Bengals have gotten things together. They had a good game against the Texans, beat the Steelers 2 weeks ago, but I got the Ravens all over Cincinnati to try to get that playoff spot. And finally, Indianapolis over Jacksonville. I know the Jaguars. Didn't the Jaguars beat the Colts in week 1? I think the Jaguars are going to end up with a 15-game losing streak to end the season, finishing at 1-15, and Phillip Rivers will get that win for Indianapolis. Tim, how about you?
Well, I am going to say this. Don't count out Jacksonville because now they can actually play football without having to tank, considering that number 1 pick is locked no matter what they do.
But but at the same time, I mean, they were pretty confident against the Bears. They played them tough in the first half, and the Bears pulled away, and the Colts are a better football team than the Bears, and the Colts are still trying to get into the playoffs in the first place. So I think Indianapolis is going to prevail.
So, by the way, because you mentioned that, those, in my opinion, are 3 teams, and your 3 AFC teams, may I add, that are going to make the AFC playoffs. Miami, unfortunately for you, you're probably going to lose week 17, and you're probably going to be the unfortunate team that misses out of the playoffs. But on my end, again, there we go. I kind of gave a precursor to my pick, and I'm going to go with the Buffalo Bills claiming the 2 seed and beating the Miami Dolphins week 17. This offense has been explosive. Yes, Miami has a very, very good defense that has had the capability of shutting down big offenses, but I just don't know if you can shut down Josh Allen, and the fact that he has a capability of providing 2 1,000-yard receivers out of Cole Beasley and Stephon Diggs makes this team a dual threat. I also expect the run game to be a little bit successful with Devin Singletary. I really think Buffalo's going to have another big offensive game and carry their momentum going into the playoffs. And Bills fans, start being optimistic. I know they didn't have a chance against the Chiefs early, but this team's really come to form. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're alive yet again this year in the playoffs. Now, I predict the entirety of the NFC East, as you mention Eddie, and it kind of goes from fandom, if I'm being honest. And my scenario I would like to see, but let's be honest, probably not going to see. And we'll start with the 1 p.m. game of the New York Giants playing the Dallas Cowboys. I have the Giants going neck to neck, beating Dallas. Let's be honest, as a Giants fan, it hurts after the fact that the Giants should have beat them earlier this season, but didn't. It seems like it's always that way against the Dallas Cowboys. However, what a week it would be for the Giants to get redemption, beat Dallas in a meaningful football game. I'll tell you what, I put it on the coaches this week in particular. Play all the cards. We know the talent isn't there, but play all the cards. Call the closest to perfect game you can. Treat it like it's the Super Bowl. At the end of the day, yes, the Giants haven't had a good year, but I give Joe Judge an A+ and that entire coaching staff for the progress this team has made. Sure, it's not a winning football team, but ever since day one, he's emphasized that this team is still developing, and I buy into that. So, week 17, you go out there and you play hard. They have these players play for you. If you beat Dallas, you have a chance of punching in the ticket, which then goes to my Sunday night football prediction of the Philadelphia Eagles beating Washington. And it all goes to this factor. What Alex Smith are we going to see? Are we going to see the Alex Smith that charged after he came back against the Giants and lost and put together that win streak of good football? Or are we going to see the Alex Smith that is running all over the pocket, has to throw off his front foot, and is going to throw directly into the hands of Philadelphia defenders? And let's be honest, that secondary for Philadelphia is still ugly. It's not good. Everyone is hurt. But at the end of the day, that offense, since the quarterback change, has really looked solid. This team is putting together productive drives. And unfortunately, I truthfully now believe it is the end for Carson Wentz in Philadelphia. Sure, this team has nothing to play for, but at the same time, this team can win football games and has the capability. And come Sunday night, I think you're going to see the stars shine yet again for Philadelphia to end out the year strong.
Yeah, the Eagles have certainly shown, some spurts. They had a good start against Dallas, and of course they beat New Orleans. So it'll be fun to see. And I really think this is Doug Peterson's last game. So we'll see if he can end it on a high note. And let's end this show on a high note and end the year as well. This is the end of 2020, our first year of Sports Speak, episode 40. We'll be back in 2021 next Friday, probably. We're going to try to get Zoe Alter on so we can preview the NFL playoffs, a jam-packed 6-game wildcard weekend. But before we sign off, it's been a weird year in sports with the shutdown, the return, bubbles, and all kinds of chaos in the MLB playoffs, NBA, and the NFL. Tim, I want you to share, and then I'll go as well, some of your top memories from 2020 in sports.
If I'm being honest, it probably has to go back, to maybe the week in particular of the NBA Finals and how we saw sports then, because I really think it was the first fact that we had, for example, an exciting NHL Finals that went on prior, and then you turn around and see what we see this particular week. We thought sports this year wasn't going to happen. But yet, the NBA put on a clinic of how to treat COVID, how to deal with its players, and kept everyone safe. We saw the Miami Heat play in the NBA Finals. No one would have predicted that this year. Not a single soul. We saw the Boston Celtics make the Eastern Conference Championship. And yet, yes, don't get me wrong, the Lakers won it for Kobe Bryant, but we saw something that no one expected. This year we saw Chase Elliott win the NASCAR Cup Series championship. We also saw, obviously, the Kansas City Chiefs, which we weren't doing this podcast yet, but also win the Super Bowl this year for the first time. To me, or I should say the first time in a while, to me, it's the fact of the matter that this year had so many firsts in 2020. And really, those championship Game 7 moments, especially this year for the Dodgers in the World Series, really came to fruition for the fact of just, that every year is new and you don't know what to expect. And I'm thankful that this year in sports has been incredible. And again, I already said it because of how COVID's been. I'm not going to be surprised come 2021 if we get a whole new ball game in every single sport. But those by far have been some of the memories in those Game 7 moments that have excited me the most, Eddie.
Yeah, I've actually got 5. I'm going to do a little countdown here. I'm going to start at number 5. I'm just going to say the NBA bubble in general. The fact that Adam Silver was able to do such an undertaking and find that success, and not just, the health side. I mean, those games were exciting, and with the fans on Zoom, I mean, it was a little weird at first, but, it still looked like there were fans there, and especially that Luka Doncic buzzer beater, and when the Lakers won the finals. I mean, everybody was pumped. And how else could you get, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Paul Pierce, Snoop Dogg all sitting next to each other? You get it on screens. You just do that. So I put that at number 5. Number 4, trying to see how I'm going to put this. I'll put the Chiefs. I think, it's been coming together for Kansas City. They blew that AFC Championship game against the Patriots 2 years ago. The fact that everything came together, and, I mean, with how they did in the playoffs, coming from behind against Houston, coming from behind against the Titans, how fitting was it that then they had to come from behind in the Super Bowl to beat the San Francisco 49ers? Damian Williams. I mean, it's so funny how just months later, Damian Williams isn't even that much of a part of the Kansas City offense anymore because of Clyde Edwards-Helaire being their new star running back. But the Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes getting that well-deserved Super Bowl, and they're definitely favorites heading into this season. Number 3, I'm going to go with the Tampa Bay Rays. They did not win the World Series, but that run they went on throughout the postseason and the short season was definitely impressive. Randy Arozarena hitting all those homers. I know you didn't enjoy this, but Mike Barrasso homering off of Aroldis Chapman at Petco Park has to be one of my top sports moments of the year. But yeah, I'm going to definitely go with that. Number 2, I think this might be an underrated one. We kind of forgot about it. But the NBA All-Star Game, just a couple of weeks before the pandemic, when they changed the rule and you had first team to 24 points in the fourth quarter, I mean, that was exciting because it took almost a half hour because both teams were at like 22, and the defense being played in the All-Star Game. Everybody hates the All-Star Game because the team will score up 200 points. There was finally incentive to play defense, and it was so fun to see the stars battle it out. But number 1 memory for me, I mean, for us NASCAR fans, Ryan Newman's crash was very scary in the Daytona 500. To see him okay just 2 days later, walking with his daughters, and even more shocking, just 3 months later, back in the car when NASCAR got back racing at Darlington, seeing him up there, and in just his second race back, get a top 10 finish in the Darlington night race. Really great to see. It was great to see Newman come back. I really hope that he can get another win in NASCAR because he's come so close so many times at so many of these plate tracks. Even after the injury, he really performed just as well as he typically does throughout the NASCAR season. So I'm really hoping 2021 we can see him get a victory. But those are my top 5 memories. I think that's a good way to wrap up this show. So we hope everybody had a Merry Christmas and has a great Happy New Year. And like we said, next Friday, we'll be back to preview the NFL playoffs. We'll try to get Zoe Alter on, maybe Raheel as well. You can follow our Twitter at SportsSpeak Live for updates on that. Until then, I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
We'll see you next time here on SportsSpeak.